I am Marilyn Marvin, the acting director for the library, and I want to thank you for joining us on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I have my cheat sheet so I don't forget to say anything, but your Fort Worth Public Library, we strive to fulfill our goal of creating space and opportunities for conversations and to empower lifelong learning. I believe tonight's special program is one of these opportunities. I want to recognize, excuse me, just a second. I want to recognize Fort Worth City Council member Elizabeth Beck, who had hoped to be here tonight, but for circumstances beyond her control could not be here, who had helped us spread the word about this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Linda Barrett, the manager of our Genealogy, Local History, and Archives Department.
Thank you, Marilyn. Before I introduce this evening's speakers, I'm going to read a short poem that was written by Hannah Senish, who was one of 37 Jews who parachuted into Yugoslavia during World War I to assist in the rescue of Hungarian Jews about to be deported to German death camp at Auschwitz. That was actually World War II, I'm so sorry. Senish was arrested at the Hungarian border, then imprisoned and tortured, but refused to reveal details of her mission. Blessed is the Match by Hannah Senish. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. Blessed is the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. Blessed is the heart with strength to stop its beating for honor's sake. Blessed is the match consumed in kindling flame. And now I will introduce you to Hollis Ava Weiner, a native of Washington, D.C., who is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Maryland. For a decade, beginning in 1986, she worked as a news reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. She left the paper in 1997 to finish a book, Jewish Stars in Texas, Rabbis and Their Work, published by the Texas A&M University Press. This book was followed by 4 others, among them the Centennial History of Rivercrest Country Club. Hollis contributed chapters to the book Quiet Voices, Southern Rabbis and Civil Rights, Grace and Gumption, Stories of Fort Worth Women, and to the award-winning book Texas Women and Ranching. Her chapter in the ranching book is about Fort Worth native Frances Rosenthal Callison, the only Jewish woman in the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame. Hollis nominated her. As one book led to another, Hollis enrolled at UTA for a master's degree in history and archives. For the past 20 years, she has been volunteer director at the Fort Worth Jewish Archives, which has offices at both Beth-El Congregation and Congregation Ahava Shalom. During the pandemic, the Star-Telegram rehired her to write a monthly local history column. She loves writing for hometown readers. Mrs. Weiner is joined this evening by Rabbi Emeritus Ralph D. Mecklenburger, who came to Beth-El in 1984 and came to be known as everybody's rabbi. In his first year in Fort Worth, Rabbi Mecklenburger came to be recognized as a peacemaker and mediator. His work in Fort Worth's interfaith community gave Judaism the status of a leading local religion. Rabbi Mecklenburger was at the helm of Beth-El during the construction of their new synagogue at the turn of the century. He also authored the book, Our Religious Brains, which was published in 2012. Mrs. Weiner said of the rabbi's work that Beth-El, once a classical Reform synagogue where few knew Hebrew, has turned into a temple that teaches the Hebrew Aleph Bet to kindergartners, enjoys cantorial music, and annually sends dozens of children to camp and to Israel. With a burgeoning religious school, a growing endowment, a stable staff, and consensus within the congregation, Rabbi Mecklenburger has guided Beth-El back to the future and into its second century. And with no further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Hollis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming out on this really cold night. And Marilyn, thank you for your introduction. And I especially want to thank Linda Barrett. Linda, as an archivist, is my friend and my colleague. And when she really wanted to do a good program for Holocaust Remembrance Day, but she didn't want to do anything anything, let's say, morbid, and she wanted something to be enlightening and promising. And when she hit on this idea and realized that we had a Holocaust Torah at Beth-El, she gave me a call, and I said, sure, I can tell you the story. This Torah turned into sort of a transatlantic pilgrimage for me to learn all about it. So, yeah, I'd love to do that. And so thank you very much, Linda. I know that, let me see if I'm not real techie here. Let's see, is this going to change?
Yeah.
Here we go. Well, this is Texas, believe it or not. Elizabeth Beck, our council representative, was going to be here tonight. And her Jewish roots in Texas go to Brenham, Texas. I'm sure that's the home of Blue Bell ice cream. In the 1890s, there was a Polish community there that built this little synagogue, and I wanted to show it tonight because the interior, the design of the interior is somewhat like the synagogue in Czechoslovakia that our Holocaust Torah scroll originally came from. And we'll get back to that later. So I wanted to give a little introduction about Jews in Texas. Are you aware that Jews have always been here? 3 Jews died at the Alamo. And in Fort Worth, in the 1890s, a group of Jews who spoke Yiddish and prayed in Hebrew founded Congregation Ahavat Shalom, which means love of peace. And then 10 years later, 47 Jews who'd been in America for about a generation, they started Beth-El Congregation. Now they spoke English, they prayed in English. I don't think they knew a word of Hebrew. But they started their synagogue. So from the beginning, from 1892, we had a very observant congregation here, a traditional one. And starting in 1902, we had, a more acculturated is the word, congregation of Jews. And the Jewish people have always been active in Fort Worth. So what I wanted to talk about is the Torah at Beth-El. Oh, I know what. From the very beginning, I've studied the early minutes of both congregations, and from the very beginning, there was discussion about how they were going to get their very first Torah scroll. The Torah is foundational in Judaism. Shall we? And we'll show you. We brought our Holocaust Torah tonight. Okay. Now the Torah, you see, it has a beautiful
Mantle.
Beautiful mantle. This is a pointer, a silver pointer. The Torah, because you don't want to soil the Torah with your fingers when you're reading it, so a pointer is used. And we'll take off this garment, the mantle, because to us the Torah is like, I want to say, it's royalty.
You ready?
Yep, go ahead. Here we go. Shall I?
You want me to talk? I'm ready.
Yes, you're talking.
Okay. I'll pick that up again in a minute, but let me set it down and say this is a Torah. As was mentioned, you really can't have a synagogue without a Torah, and at least 10 people, used to be 10 men in the Orthodox world, in order to get together and pray and read the Torah. But what exactly is the Torah? All right. So if you know the Bible at all, it's the first 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, sometimes called the Pentateuch. Starts with Genesis, then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But a Torah is not only that, it is the oldest form of it that we've got. It's handwritten on parchment by a scribe called a sofer, a book writer, with a quill pen. But when I say, a handwritten, that's beautiful, you can see, beautiful calligraphy. But notice that it's got a justified margin on both sides of each column. And the letters go across straight, column after column. It's really beautifully done. And this one, as you're going to hear, is a couple of 100 years old, and is actually one of our lighter ones. It's really a very high quality, beautiful scroll. But why a scroll? I've got a Bible at home that's got those books in it. You've got a Bible at home. You can get one in Hebrew, right? Why keep it in this form? Right? Because it's a reminder that it goes all the way back to biblical times. And in the ancient world, nobody knew what a book was with folio pages where it's sewn on one side and you can turn the pages. This was how all books were kept. A library was a pile of scrolls, right? Nowadays, we keep it this way because it reminds us that it goes all the way back to biblical times. And more than that it's not just any book, right? There are other ancient books, and you could put them on, and some people have, put them on scrolls, right? But this is God's gift, first to the Jewish people, and then through us to anyone else who wants to read it, to the Abrahamic family of religions. So Christianity and Islam read these same stories as well. So this is not just any book. When in worship, we open the Aron Kodesh, the fancy box where this is kept in any synagogue, all right? Everyone rises. Why? It's a book. Well, it is a book, but we like to think it's God's book, all right? It's God's gift to us and to everyone else. And we rise, and we don't, in services, leave it open like this. It's almost as if it's got a personality. It would be embarrassed, to be left open. So we close it up again. As we walk around the sanctuary with it before reading it, people want to touch it, to kiss it, not literally, and we want to keep it clean, but this is really a dust cover. That's what a mantle is for a Torah, all right? We want to keep it clean and treat it respectfully, but in fact, we rise as it's walked around. We're rising before God. We know it's a book. We know it's made of parchment. It can be repaired, right? But it's God's gift to us. It reminds us of God. All right? Now, when I say it's God's gift to us, what does that mean? Well, as most of you probably know, the 10 Commandments are in here, right? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is in here. I mean, all our basic values, which have become among the basic values of Western civilization, are in here. So there's nothing that we hold in greater esteem, all right, than not only books, we're a very academic people, all right, but this book as the root of all of the rest of the tree of life that is Torah literature, all right, the rest of the Bible, rabbinic literature, modern philosophers that root themselves in the wisdom of this book. This is symbolically the center of it all.
Thank you, Rabbi. In 2002, when Beth-El celebrated its 100th anniversary, I wrote the centennial history of the congregation. And I could not find very much information about the Holocaust Torah. All that I found was why we got it and when we got it, but not too much about its origins. We got it in 1971. It came to Beth-El. We had a rabbi here during World War II whose name was Samuel Soskin, and he spoke out against Nazi Germany from the start. And then he took a leave of absence. He enlisted in the army as a chaplain. He was overseas, and after the war, he came back. He stayed at Beth-El till about 1949, and then he went to a congregation in New York. But when he died in 1970, the congregation wanted to do something in his memory. And they'd heard about these Holocaust Torahs, and the congregation decided, let's get a Holocaust Torah in his memory. And so they weren't sure how to do it, and Rabbi Bob Schur wrote to the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in New York, how do we do this? Can you help us? And sure enough, in April of 1971, a Holocaust Torah came to Love Field. It flew on Pan American Airlines, Braniff Airlines, all things that are out of business now. And then when it came to Fort Worth, Binion O'Keefe, which is still in business, picked it up, took it to a warehouse, and then it was delivered to Beth-El. And when this Torah came, the only hint of its history was at the very bottom of the roller, which, by the way, we call the rollers that hold the Torah Eitz Chaim, which means tree of life. So at the bottom of the roller was this little little plaque that says Czech Memorial Scrolls, and ours is Torah number 281. It came from the Westminster Synagogue in London. And then we had this beautiful a certificate, which is also up there on the easel. And the certificate also says it's number 281, and at the bottom it's from Neves in Czechoslovakia, and it was written in 1800. Well, where is Neves? So I looked on the map, and that was Czechoslovakia, which again doesn't exist anymore. And then I started looking for Neves, and I couldn't find it. All kinds of cities in that area. So I contacted the Czech Memorial Scrolls website and said, where does this come from? Tell me more about it. And they said, well, as it turns out, Neves is now incorporated into Prague. They extended their city limits, just like Fort Worth does periodically. And so that's where it was, just outside of Prague, the capital. And they said that the synagogue there had 7 Torahs. And they were all distributed in London and in America. And they knew of one congregation in England that was really active, and this British congregation had done a lot of work and made contact with the people in Neves. And they said Neves had no more Jews. Before the war, Neves and all the towns around it had about 386 Jews, and after the war, only 42 survived, and none of them resettled there. So there were no Jews anymore. But there was a contact person, this woman who you see smiling, that's Lybusa Votovova. Lybusa had many Jewish friends. She was a child when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. She remembered what it was like, how harsh it was. She had to learn German and study in German, and she took it upon herself after the war to try and revive the memories of the Jewish community, to save pictures, to gather letters, so that their memory would not be forgotten. As chance would have it, my husband Bruce and I were planning a trip to Eastern Europe, and on our itinerary was the city of Prague. So we went to Prague. So when we got to Prague, beautiful city, got on the phone, and I called Lybusa. And I'm talking, fortunately, I'm rusty in German, but I talked to her in German, saying, here's my story, and we have one of your Torahs in Texas. And she said, no, you don't. The Torah is in London. No, I said, well, no, there's also another one in Texas. And she goes, Texas? She just was flabbergasted that a Torah from her village would end up in Texas, and that there was more than one. My God, there's 7. So she said, okay, I'll meet you tomorrow. And she gave us the directions to get to Neves. And she said, meet me outside of the old synagogue. It's on the main avenue. And meet me under the plaque. So Bruce and I went to the synagogue. And outside there was this plaque, beautiful bronze plaque, that the people from the synagogue in London had put up, which encapsulates the history of the Jews of Neves. She also brought her daughter with her. You can see how cold it was. It was December. And she said, okay, come on inside. This used to be the synagogue. And when we went in, I thought, oh, well, it's not anymore. Today, what do they do with an old synagogue? They turn it into a place that sells storm windows. She ushered me into a room. Yes, because after the war, there were no Jews to come back to it. Initially, it was a laundromat. And then after a while, they were just going to demolish it. However, after the war, the Czech officials set up like a Jewish preservation committee, and Lybusa was the representative to it from this city. They wanted to tear it down, but she interceded, and the Jewish preservation committee agreed. The building was renovated and rented out, and that's why today there's a storm window company in it. So we sat down in this meeting room, and I opened up our centennial book, and I showed her things that we'd written about the Torah, and she began to tell me the Jewish history of Neves. So Neves was one of these colorful medieval villages with a, quaint and picturesque, with a nice coat of arms and a knight in shining armor on the coat of arms. So on the left, that's the way the synagogue building looks today. On the right is the way it looked in the 1940s. It was actually a beautiful classical building with arched windows and in a classical style. And they also had a cemetery. The cemetery outside of Uranevis, the Jewish cemetery, went back to the 1600s. The oldest tombstone was from the early 1600s. Yes, you can see how beautiful they are. There's the Ten Commandments on one hand, the other, the two hands, that's the sign for the Kohanim, that someone descended from the priestly tribe with the last name of Cohen. So there we were in the cemetery, and it got pretty cold. So we said, let's go back to the old synagogue where it's warm. So we went back to the synagogue, and when we got there, she took out of her purse pictures of the way the synagogue looked back in the 1940s, or in the 30s, I should say. She had been there once. Her friends had invited her, and she remembered that there were 27 steps leading upstairs to a balcony where the women prayed, and downstairs the men were praying, and you can see they left their prayer shawls over each pew. This was the Holy Ark, and inside the Ark is where they kept the Torah. You know, similar to the interior design of that little Polish synagogue in Brenham. Then she began to take out pictures of the Jewish people who had lived there. At the top, these are the Bayakovskis. They were very well-to-do. They had a farm, and only one branch of their extended family got out before Hitler invaded. And I know that because this man, George Bayakovsky, who lives in Seattle, has contacted us to find out more about Uranevis and what happened there. On the right, such a darling picture in a sled, that's the sisters Eva, Anna, and Lily, but only Lily survived the war. And this family had a store across the street from the synagogue. It was clothing and shoes. They had a wonderful business. And you know, the proximity of the synagogue to the main square in town indicates how well integrated how well accepted the Jews were in this little town. And here, this was her best friend. Leibusa's best friend was Hannah Polakova, and that's Leibusa, who is Christian, is there in the sunbonnet and the plaid dress, and her friend Hannah is in the white shirt. And then March 1939, Hitler invaded, took over, just like that. Czechoslovakia fell in an instant. And what happened? The Nazis created a list of every single Jew who lived in the region. 387 Jews in the region. And they went into the schools. And they said, and they called out the names of the Jewish kids. This is Hannah's class. Hannah is in the middle row, and another friend of hers, Irina, is in the back row. The soldiers marched into the classroom. They called the names of all the Jewish kids, and they left. And they were never seen again. Those whose names they called were told to pack up a suitcase and walk to the depot, walk to the train station, and they did. The biggest, what we call deportation, was on the afternoon of on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. They deported 212 local Jews. That was September 12th, 1942. In the meantime, they left just enough people in town, just enough Jews in town, and they gave them the task of going into the synagogue and going into Jewish homes and taking anything, any ceremonial Jewish object that they could find. That included books, embroidery, textiles, artwork, chauffeurs, to take them and to send everything to Prague. There was a Jewish museum in Prague where all of these religious items were sent to. And when they got to Prague, and in Prague, these are Torahs. This was happening all over Czechoslovakia where items were confiscated. And they told the librarians at the museum, catalog these. You've got 2 months to catalog them. And they did. They cataloged them. Now, what did they do with all these things? Where do you store them? It turned out the museum in Prague was quite large. It had a large cellar. And the museum controlled lots of different buildings. All of the beautiful things, I want to say, that showed artistic value, like silver, carvings, artwork, those were put in 60 buildings in the Jewish section, underground, in cellars, and so that they were protected in case there was bombings. But And these survived the war, and they now tour the world, really, for exhibits that we call the Precious Legacy. But what about the Torahs? As we said before, once you take the cover, the dust cloth off the Torah, the parchment gets dusty, it gets grimy, and they stored the Torahs in an abandoned synagogue on the outskirts of town in the woods. They built them on shelves, and they had tags telling exactly where they came from. And they stayed there for 20 years, untouched, unread, unrolled. And people forgot about them. And of course they forgot about them because Czechoslovakia was dominated by the Soviets and the Communist Party. They disavowed all religion. They didn't see any value in a Torah scroll, no. They could see value in silver or in fine paintings or fine embroidery, but not in this parchment that was falling apart. I mean, it was getting moldy. Bugs were nesting in it. What were they going to do with it? Well, after the war, let's go back here. There were, as we got into the 50s and the 60s, art dealers began visiting the Czech Republic and saying, we want to get some remnants of Eastern Europe. There's a good market for Eastern European art and for all of these ancient things from synagogues for Judaica. There was a British man who had an art gallery. He was Jewish, and he made frequent trips back and forth to Prague buying art. And on one of his trips, he talked to someone from the government art agency, and he said to them, do you have anything religious? My parents were Russian refugees, and I think they'd like something that was religious from Eastern Europe. And the man from the government art agency said to him, you want a Torah? I've got 1,500. Oh my gosh, 1,500. Well, let me see them. And when he took him out to the woods to see all these sad-looking Torah scrolls. And the art dealer knew he didn't have the expertise to decide if this was the real thing, was this true or not. And he said, well, okay, let me bring over an expert. And they had an expert in Hebraica who was at Oxford University, who came and spent 12 days there. The professor said it was just heart-rending because these scrolls, some of them were wrapped up in ragged prayer shawls. Some of them were bound together with children's belts. Others were just tied with string. There were two that were even bound together with a lady's corset. And the wood was falling apart. It was just horrible, and he thought, but he knew they were the real thing. Now, it's rare to come across a Torah in that time because in most of the places that Hitler invaded, they set fire to the synagogues, and some of these scrolls were scorched. And they say that if a Torah burns, the words go to heaven. Be that as it may, the art dealer really wanted to arrange to buy these, and the Czech government wanted to sell them because they needed currency. Now, the Israeli government had gotten wind of these 1,500 Torah scrolls, and they wanted them too, but they wouldn't pay for them. They told the Czechs, you owe it to us after killing so many people. Well, the Czechs, they wanted the money. So when the British fellow was willing to, the British fellow found a philanthropist who was willing to cover the cost of the Torahs and all the costs of moving them and restoring them. The agreed upon price was $30,000. In February, do we have that? In February of 1964, they were loaded onto two giant trucks, and they went across the English Channel to the White Cliffs of Dover, to London, and then to the Czech Memorial Scrolls Center. It's at the Westminster Synagogue. And the Westminster Synagogue, unlike our synagogues, which are standalone buildings, this synagogue was in a place called Kent House, a very stately mansion. And on the first floor was the synagogue with the sanctuary, and on one of the upper floors, they decided that was where they would bring all the Torah scrolls. Here are the scrolls. And what did they do at first? Well, they cataloged them. They all had tags on them that told where they were from. They began to number them, which is why ours is number 281. But they had 1,564 scrolls. So for about 6 weeks, they were going through these, and they were trying to find scribes who could repair them, but where are you going to find somebody to do that? Well, there were a few Hebrew scribes, but they were already busy. They would come and work on a page or a leaf for a day, but nobody could devote full time to it. And then one day, I will read this to you, about 2 months, after they'd been there for 2 months. I'm going to read this from the book. It's called Out of the Midst of Fire. One day, there was a knock on the door. A woman named Ruth Schaefer answered the door of Kent House. Standing there was an Orthodox Jew, all in black with a long beard and a wide-brimmed hat. He spoke Yiddish. He said, "Es gibt Torot? Do you have any Torahs for repair?" Ruth Schaefer nearly fainted. "Yes, we have 1,564. Do come in." He was overwhelmed by the sight, and in a mixture of halting English, Yiddish, Hebrew, and French, he said that he was indeed a sofer, which means a scribe, and he was looking for work. Okay, so Rabbi, tell us what it takes to repair a Torah.
You take one after another sheet of parchment, and actually a sofer will scratch lines on it to make the original so that they end up nice and straight like that. There's a tradition of how many columns there are and so on and so forth. And with a quill pen and basically India ink, letter by letter, and sometimes with decorations on letters. This one has some. There are some that are more elaborate. You write it painstakingly, one bit at a time. You'll note, you can see the stitching on the back. Got to be careful with it. You can see the stitching that they, and a little bit of tape that they get it all to stay together with. So you need, for a new one, you need parchment, which is animal skin. It has to be kosher animal skin. What does that mean? It has to be a kosher animal, cloven hoof, and all of that sort of stuff. Cow, goat, sheep, you know. But so it's parchment. It's fine parchment. And then you write. And as you can see from this one, which we think is 200 years old, they last a long time. They don't last thousands of years. But there are people who, the sofrim, the scribes, who earn their living. It takes at least 6 months, maybe 8 and 10, depends on how quickly they work, all right? If they find a mistake, they throw away the whole section that they're working on, which is not a huge amount, all right? But then if years later you find a mistake in a Torah, you bring in a sofer who will scratch out the mistake with a razor blade and correct it, all right? If I'm sure at the Westminster Synagogue project, if what you have is 4 books and Deuteronomy is missing, right, then you write Deuteronomy, or you find one that's in horrible condition and you sew in just the last one. This is really a very nice scroll, this particular one. It's light parchment, so it's not hard to walk around with. Some of them can get very heavy. And beautiful calligraphy. You can come up afterwards and see it, those who would like. So, you know, how do you write a Torah, or how do you fix a Torah? You need somebody who knows how to do it. You need the parchment. You need the gid, which is also from an animal. It's like gut that you would string a guitar with. You sew the Torah leaves together with. Until you've got a whole scroll, and then you put them on these wooden staves, which Hollis mentioned. Each we call an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, because the Torah, it says in the Bible, is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it. So this enables us to hold fast to it and pass it on from generation to generation. And more than that, actually or symbolically, read through the whole Torah each year. Some communities read through a third of it over a 3-year cycle. But in fact, the whole idea is to turn it and turn it again, said the ancient rabbis, for everything is in it. What you need to know to live a good life is in here. All right? So they had all of these Torahs. Not all of them were fully restorable. And in a synagogue, you only want to read from one that's kosher, which means permitted. But why would it be permitted? Because it's a perfect copy of what we regard as God's Word. Right? Well, if it were missing a page, would it matter that much? Yes. All right? In any religious tradition, we want to give our best to God, and certainly the book that represents God to us, we want to be in perfect shape. So this one is a kosher Torah. I don't know how many years ago it was, but we had a Rabbi Bernard Honan, a rabbi in East Texas, who was also a sofer, and he came through and went through all of our Torahs, including this one, and made notes on them, and we have all kinds of information about what they are and what needed to be done, and he fixed them up for a small fee. And so we know that this is a fully perfect, so far as we know, copy. Just as a quick digression, and then I'll turn it back to Hollis. Once in my whole 50 years in the rabbinate, we found a mistake in the Torah. It wasn't this one, but there was a mistake in the Torah. It happens. It's handwritten after all right? Bar mitzvah kid said, was practicing, and I said, no, that's wrong. It's this, it's not that. And he said, no, it says this. I said, it couldn't. He said, yeah, look. And there was a letter that was wrong. So soon after, we had a sofer come in and fix it. So it's a kosher Torah again. All right? But we treat it lovingly because this is the center of Judaism and also, as I said, a foundation of Western civilization.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'll tell a little anecdote too. In the minutes of Ahavat Shalom for the first many years, they're in Yiddish, and when they were reading their very first Torah, the minutes one day said, they found a mistake. They found a misspelled word in the Torah, and the minutes just ended like chaotically, and so I would assume that the same thing. The people who understand what is in it can see the mistake. Just like you, don't you often find mistakes in the newspaper? Doesn't it drive you crazy? What if you knew every word of this and you found a mistake and it's a holy book, you would take care of it right away. So what happened with the Westminster Synagogue as they began to, let's say, restore the Torahs, have more and more kosher Torahs, they began to get requests from all over the world. People congregations and institutions wanted to have a Holocaust Torah. It has so much meaning. So they're getting requests from all over, and they came up with a policy. They decided that they would loan the Torahs. They would make permanent loans to new congregations, to institutions, and so that they would be used. They gave one to the White House, has one that was given to the White House when Jimmy Carter was president. Queen Elizabeth has one in her personal library. Many Christian, Catholic, and Protestant hospitals have them for their chapels, so that they are being used. Because in order to be useful, a Torah has to be rolled and unrolled. The air has to circulate around it. And Uranevis had 7 Torahs, and these are the cities and the places where they are today. I've only been in touch with the people from the last one, the Finchley Reformed Synagogue in England, because they've done so much work with Uranevis. So the next part of this pilgrimage is that I became pen pals with Libusa. Letters went back and forth all the time. Anytime there was an event in Uranevis that had to do with commemorating the Jews, I got something from her about it. I got booklets and posters, and anytime the people from England came or she went to England, again, she sent me information about it. So we were regular pen pals. Is that showing up? Yes. Fortunately, it gets harder and harder to read the German. It's been a long time. Really, are we going around? Okay, and then in 2009, she sent me a letter saying she was coming to Texas in August. My God, she was 79. August? Yeah, you know what it was like. Yeah, it was one of these 100-degree heat waves, but she was coming with her friends because there was a major gymnastics competition at the Tarrant County Convention Center. And she told me all about Sokol. I'd never heard of it before. Sokol is a gymnastics and physical fitness movement that started in the Czech Republic, like in the 1800s, something like 1843, and it caught on. And Fort Worth has a so-called chapter, and it started here in 1913. Who knew? And when the kids who work out in there are the ones who get involved in Gymnastics USA and are competing for the Olympics. So she came, well, I'm coming, and I'm thinking, it's 108 degrees. But we had her over for dinner. We had a wonderful dinner of kugel and brisket, and I invited 3 friends who speak German. Some of you may know Brigitte Altman came, and 2 of her friends, Hilda and Helmut, came. And then took her to services. She was in her glory at services. She was introduced. We talked about the Holocaust scroll, and we had a beautiful service that night. And afterwards, we unrolled the scroll, and people came up to look at it and talk about it. And she was so grateful to know the care that we'd taken of it, something 200 years old from her village. And the next chapter of this adventure I had, getting to know the Torah, I read about a Holocaust Torah reunion. It was in New York 3 years ago. And I sure wanted to go, so I did. Here we go. People came from 72 different congregations, most of them up and down the East Coast. And they brought their Torahs, and initially we laid them out so you could look at everybody's Torah mantle. They were so decorative. You want to see that too? Sure. There's ours. There we go. There's ours with the centennial book by it. That's right. That's right. It was at Temple Emmanuel in New York. And we had a procession. They played music, they sang, and everybody stood while we walked around the auditorium with our Torahs. It was very, very emotional. People talked about their Torahs, how they had designed the mantles, what it meant. There were some congregations that didn't even know they had a Holocaust Torah because their congregation had merged. The little metal plate had fallen off. But the people in London tracked them down and said, you've got one. And because you can lose people, you can lose track of it. When a congregation merges, when it dies, what happens? And so a lot of interesting stories were exchanged. And this is my good friend. This is Sam Gruber. He's a historian, and he brought his Torah from Syracuse. And I'm showing this because Sam's Jewish roots are in Texas, in Brenham, the same place where Elizabeth Beck's family came from back in the 1890s. And here are all these Torah scrolls. You can see all the artistry and meaning and thought. Yes, yeah, all that went into it. And they're all handmade. The designs are. And here's some that are really stirring. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, it looks like the uniform they wore at the uniform, what they were given to wear at the concentration camp with the Jewish star. Some have the dates of their community. Others are more colorful and more hopeful. Yeah, each Torah cover was a meaningful work of art. And what I learned from all my pilgrimages with the Torah is that a Holocaust scroll comes with responsibility. Like, we have a responsibility to remember the people who worshiped with this Torah. We have a responsibility to remember their names. When I showed the pictures of the people who lived in Urenevis, I put their names in the captions because they don't have gravestones. So it's so important for us to preserve this and to look upon it as a responsibility. The Torah, it's not a museum piece. It's something to be read, to be learned from, to be rolled and unrolled and aired out. It's to be used because it's a treasure. It really is a family heirloom. Thank you all very much.
What you just said.
Says, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel, Jews, live. All right? We read this. The people from Czechoslovakia live with us a bit. We remember. Questions?
Yes, questions. Questions. Questions? I can't believe it. Okay. Yes, Barry.
In use at this point, is it read regularly or only on special occasions?
We don't do, we have 6 Torahs. We don't read it every 6 weeks. But yeah, from time to time, It's really used, yes. There's been a bar mitzvah with it, or this or that. This one, when you come up later, anybody who wants to see it, is set. She said we read it on Rosh Hashanah. This one is set to Kedoshim, which actually we read on Yom Kippur afternoon in the Reformed tradition. So, but it may have just come up at Leviticus at that point, the last time it was used. But yes, we really use it.
Was the act of saving the Torah, did that happen in other countries in Europe at the time, or is Czechoslovakia the only place that was able to preserve the Torah?
It was only in Czechoslovakia. Everywhere else, things were destroyed. Like I said, synagogues were torched with people in them, and the Torahs were desecrated, torn up, turned to ash. But in Czechoslovakia, because they had this wonderful Jewish museum in the center of town, they knew they had learned people. They had people who could catalog it, and we know that the Germans were very meticulous and liked to make their lists and catalog things. So the idea came from whoever the supreme SS person was there to collect everything and catalog it and put it in and put it into the museum and have it there. Do you want to?
Well, there are those who think, we don't have evidence of this apparently, those who think the Nazis wanted to make a museum to an extinguished people when the whole war was over. The Torahs to them were nothing, even though they were everything to us. But all these pieces of silver, and you saw them on shelves, lines and lines of them, they could have been melted down and sold. I mean, they were really of value. They were keeping them because they were proud of the atrocities that they were doing. And that's why we have this International Holocaust Memorial Day, because we're proud to keep their memory alive and to condemn bigotry of all sorts, but especially, of course, anti-Semitism that led to this Holocaust. Yes?
Were most, probably not all, of the 1,500 plus, even if there was only one book that was usable, there weren't any that just got so...
Nothing was thrown away, all right? There's a two-part answer to that. I'm going to give you one, and then Hollis, who is at the museum, can tell you the second part. When a Torah wears out, again, we don't have any 3,000 or 2,200-year-old Torahs anymore. They do wear out. Anything with God's name on it, for the Orthodox, all right, will be buried as if you were burying a person, in a geniza, in a special section of the cemetery, all right? So Jews would never have thrown away the fragments, the unusable parts. But there's more than that to say, because you were at the museum.
Yes, in London, and if they had some that they could not fully repair, they keep them on exhibit. Some synagogues say, well, give us a fragment, give us part of it, and we'll put it in a special case. I know Ahavad Shalom has a Holocaust Torah that is not, they say it's not kosher, and they keep it on display as a remembrance of what happened. So that's right, nothing is thrown away, especially of this precious legacy.
Rabbi, I was about 13 when I was bar mitzvah, and I had the honor of carrying the scroll around the synagogue, as you mentioned earlier. My question is about the sofars. Are there still a lot of scribes around that help to restore Torahs or to create new ones?
I can't give you an answer to how many there are. There are a lot of them in Israel. I mean, people who earn their living copying Torahs. And there are plenty here. So you can get a brand new handwritten Torah. It'll cost you, I mean, this is 6 or 8 or 10 months of somebody's life, so they're not cheap. But yes, there are still people who write them. Is that 500 in the world or 5,000 in the world? I have no idea. But yes, this tradition goes on.
And they're training women to be scribes these days.
Yes.
Right, Rabbi Mandel.
Yeah, we have a colleague up here. Rabbi Mandel, you want to add to that?
Yes. First of all, You may face that way. It's okay. So first of all, in the blurb, I guess, speaking about this event, Rabbi Mecklenburger was mentioned as having welcomed my predecessor to Fort Worth, and I just want to say that Rabbi Mecklenburger, ideologically we may be worlds apart, but his friendship and his leadership have been a blessing to me for the last almost 20 years, so thank you for that. As far as scribes writing Torahs, you may not be aware of this, but there's actually a major shortage and spiking prices because of the shortage of scribes. But the scribes that I do know are extremely busy. Now, as far as repairing old Torahs, it all boils down to finance. If it's going to cost $25,000 to restore it, you can buy a new one for $25,000. Although it's hilarious that Czechoslovakia only took $30,000 for 1,500. Now you can barely buy one for 30,000. So, if it's going to cost 2,000 to repair a Torah, yeah, we'll do it. But if it's going to cost 25,000, they just usually don't spend the money. But as to whether there are still scribes, I have not yet written anything, but when I was in yeshiva in Israel, I did study it. And I actually just bought a parchment for a Purim Megillah, not for a Torah. So who knows, one of these days I may actually end up writing something we can say in Fort Worth we have our own scribe. But
Very nice. There is at least one in Dallas. And I said when Beth-El had all of its Torahs, renovated, it was Rabbi Honan from Longview, Texas, of all places. But he came, and more than once, took some of them back with him and returned them, and so on. But yes, there are still scribes.
Short comment. Just in case there's anybody of Czechoslovakian heritage here, and even if not, I'm sure you're aware that Czechoslovakia actually provided the state of Israel with their first Air Force. Under the watching eyes of the Soviets, they smuggled aircraft, military aircraft into Israel. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there someone else had their hand up before?
For whatever it's worth, I'm a big fan of Hollis as well. So.
Well, thank you. Me too.
What I was talking about in the beginning was that when the rabbi who came before him to have a Chabad house did not have a Torah, and Rabbi Mecklenburger loaned him a Torah to use until they had their own. Anyway, all good relations among in our intra-faith community, for which we're very grateful. I appreciate you and Hannah being here tonight. Okay. I think that's it. Hey, you've been a great audience.
And if anybody wants to see, you may.
Thank you so much. Come on up, take a look. Take a look at